From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Please Explain. I'm Samantha Selinger-Morris. It's Thursday, August 31st. Qantas CEO Alan Joyce is arguably one of Australia's most criticised executives. That his airline announced a record $2.47 billion in profits over the last financial year, when so many Australians are struggling with the cost of living, hasn't helped his reputation. But it isn't just his famously ruthless business acumen that is currently making headlines around the country. Instead, Alan Joyce is currently at the centre of a scandal which questions whether he has undue influence over Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. Today, aviation reporter Amelia McGuire on why the federal government is being grilled about a recent aviation decision regarding Qatar Airways and whether it is guilty of stifling market competition. So, Amelia, headlines about Qantas have dominated newspapers for more than a month now. And then in Adelaide on Tuesday, Anthony Albanese was forced to weigh in. So were you surprised that the Prime Minister has weighed in on this?
It does seem like a particularly niche issue for the Prime Minister to weigh in on at the face of it. But I think Qantas generally, its massive profit that it's just announced and basically anything to do with consumers and airfares at the moment is really topical.
Message from the Qantas CEO a week after the airline announced more than $1 billion in profit. Alan Joyce appearing before a Senate committee on a day...
Joyce admits the airline owes almost $500 million in COVID flight credits to customers, $100 million more than previously estimated.
Alan Joyce grilled over the dismissal of 1,700 workers during COVID while pocketing $125 million in his 15 years as CEO.
So don't you feel embarrassed? Because I tell you what, I'd feel embarrassed if I was you.
I know you're getting a bit worked up, but please.
No, I'm getting very frustrated with your answers.
And Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, former Transport Minister, has a lot to say on pretty much everything to do with aviation at the moment. The Prime Minister basically said that the airline should provide prompt refunds to those who had their flights disrupted during COVID.
Then they need to either have that money returned, or they need to be able to use those bookings in order to make future flights.
And I guess that brings us to the fact that there's currently a class action suit that's been prepared against the company on behalf of Australians who say, actually, we're still owed all this money.
That's correct. It'll be really interesting to see how that class action goes. It's been launched by a law firm called Echo Law on behalf of passengers who, yes, say that they were disrupted and have not yet received compensation in the form of either a credit or a refund from the carrier.
And I think what's at the heart of this story that's been running now, you've been reporting on it sort of nonstop, is that Anthony Albanese's involvement actually stems from growing criticism that he's now facing that the government is supporting Qantas and potentially stifling competition in the aviation market. Now, that's a pretty serious allegation. So where does this come from? How did this begin?
So it all started last year when the Qatari government applied for additional bilateral air rights to Australia on behalf of Qatar Airways. This would basically mean that Qatar Airways would double its flights from Europe through Doha to Australia. This would have put downward pressure on airfares and was welcomed by and supported by the bulk of the tourism and aviation sector. We found out last month through a report in the Financial Review that application had been rejected by the government. So the only party that we know of that is a part of the aviation sector that was in opposition to these bilateral air rights being granted was Qantas. They did so, as is their competitive right. No one has come out to criticise Qantas for launching their opposition to the bilateral air rights, but they did so and were granted, and the result ended up going in their favour. The confusing element about that is that the government have not been forthcoming with their defence for why they rejected this decision when the bulk of the aviation and tourism sector was in support of it. I mean, there's Virgin Australia, who is a code-share partner with Qatar Airways. They would have been directly benefited from the extra flights. You have Austrade, you have Flight Centre. There's a whole heap of areas in the tourism sector because they would have basically reaped hundreds of millions of dollars in additional tourism revenue because Qatar's existing flights in Australia are 97% full. So upping to double daily flights to Australia is great for the Australian tourism economy.
And so can you tell us, I guess, a bit about the voices who are making this link that perhaps the government has protected Qantas because Qantas appears to be the only company that's benefiting from this decision of the Australian government? So can you take us through this? Because there's been some pretty powerful voices enmeshed in this debate, I guess.
So the voices enmeshed in this debate range from, as I said, the head of Virgin Australia, Jane Herdlicker, the head of Flight Centre, Graham Screw-Turner, to then major political parties, including the opposition who's come out against the government's decision. I think the biggest telltale sign from the government is actually that the only consistent message that's come out has been that they maintain the additional air rights were not in the national interest. That was all fine, but quite confusing because they have not been more transparent beyond that. On Monday, Assistant Treasurer Stephen Jones came out to say that not only was Qantas's profit in the national interest, but also that the government will always support national Australian businesses over foreign businesses. And that basically inferred that the decision was made to protect Qantas rather than to protect the Australian tourism sector. It was how it was taken.
And so I'm assuming that is why opposition leader Peter Dutton has actually accused Labor of, quote, running a protection racket for Qantas?
That's correct. This is where it gets kind of in the weeds because as soon as Stephen Jones came out and made those comments, he was doorstopped and made those comments relatively on the fly. The Transport Minister, Catherine King, came back to say that she would not have characterised the rationale for her decision, it was her decision, that way. That's her effectively saying that he has misspoken. What we as the Australian public are supposed to take from that is confusing, particularly because the government have not been transparent about beyond saying it's not in the national interest as to the rationale why.
Right. And my understanding is there's even some conjecture from the opposition that Transport Minister Catherine King and her department actually supported Qatar's application but were overruled.
Yes. As I said before, the Prime Minister was the former Transport Minister. He was for many years. He plays a close eye on the aviation sector. We have no kind of clinical proof that it was his decision. He has actually come out and said that it was not his decision, that it was Catherine King's decision to oppose the rights. I should also point out that the rejection of bilateral air rights is a relatively common practice across the world. The Australian government has made the decision to reject carriers before and will do so again. That in itself is not particularly newsworthy. What is difficult to digest is how much of the sector was so in favour of the rights and there was not clear opposition against it.
Amelia, Alan Joyce is arguably the most criticised CEO in Australia. So what's he done to have given him that title?
It's a really interesting question, and I think to answer it properly, we've got to consider what it was like running an airline during COVID for any airline CEO around the world. I think Qantas particularly has been seriously criticised for its inflated airfares following the COVID-19 pandemic. The context of their $2.47 billion profit this year plays a lot into that. They also went through a period right after COVID, like all airlines, where there was a serious amount of lost bags. There was mass cancellations and mass delays across the network. All of those measures have now been fixed, and a lot of those metrics are actually doing better than they were before COVID. And yet the customer dissatisfaction and angst towards Qantas has remained. And a lot of that is down to the way that Alan Joyce handled the messaging at the time. He has since apologised many a time for Qantas not performing to its standard and the standard that it charges, but the public sentiment against him and against Qantas has remained.
So obviously a lot of people are angry about the fact that they haven't received refunds for flights that they say Qantas cancelled during the pandemic. And earlier this week, Alan Joyce was grilled in a Senate hearing about whether Qantas has actually played a role in worsening the cost of living crisis. Is that right?
That's correct. So Joyce and Stephanie Tully, the boss of Jetstar, and Andrew McGuinness, the head of Qantas's corporate affairs, recently appeared at a hearing as part of the cost of living Senate committee. It was a pretty intense exchange. It got quite hostile there for all parties at various points. But the main source of why Qantas has been accused of contributing to the cost of living crisis plays in again to airfares. The airline would say to that fuel during COVID, just after COVID, has never been higher due to the war in Ukraine. Qantas's fuel bill got to $5 billion last year, which is significantly higher than in normal years, despite them doing, at the time, half of their flying, which should indicate how bad the cost of fuel is. But the fuel bill is now normalised, and yet there are still carriers who are trying to fly to this country who can't fly to this country. Qantas has opposed them to fly to this country. So there is indication that there could be some relief on the way for airfares if other carriers were actually allowed to fly here.
And I guess to circle back to the stoush between Qantas and Qatar, do you think we'll ever find out what is actually behind the government's rejection of the Qatari application?
It's a great question. I've now kind of been writing about this issue every day for the past month, and it doesn't seem like we're going to get an answer. The government maintains the decision was not in the national interest. One thing to note, though, is that as the issue grows bigger voices are mounting, and particularly ones high-placed in competition. I mean, former ACCC chair Alan Fells came out in our papers yesterday to say that this does need to warrant an ACCC investigation. How that investigation, or whether it even comes to the surface, what it would conclude is difficult to tell, particularly because, as I said at the beginning, the rejection of a carrier to fly to Australia is not in itself noteworthy. The circumstances of this situation are, in fact, noteworthy. And there might be information the government can provide to the ACCC that will not be shared in the public forum because it may have something to do with broader geopolitical tensions or things that we're not privy to.
Well, it seems like there's a lot of questions still to be answered, so we look forward to your next report on this. Thank you, Amelia, for joining us.
Thanks so much, Sam.
Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by Julia Carr-Katzel and Tammy Mills, with technical assistance by Chi Wong. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy the show and want more of our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It's the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or smh.com.au/subscribe. I'm Samantha Selinger Morris. This is Please Explain. Thanks for listening.